Testing 1, 2, 3. We finally got all this stuff sorted. Yeah, let me give you a link to the paper. Great idea. 1 second. And you guys can all follow along. It makes it easier. And I'm going to, let me find it real quick. Here it is. Got it. And obviously as I'm going through, I'm going to pause and talk. You know, it's not just going to simply me just reading it off, but that is a great idea. Let me put this in the chat. You can follow along here. Let's see how the audio is. Man, it sounds so much better. I can't believe it. I want to do, I can also make it a little bit better by adding a filter, like a noise suppressor. How's that better? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How's that better? I don't even hear anything. It's just because you can hear the static in the background. All right, let's go. I think that's good. Welcome everybody. Just finally got everything fixed. I was experimenting the last couple days. Had some problems this morning. What I did, couldn't get the audio to work out at all, and what I did is I went into OBS and I deleted all the files and set it back to factory setting. And then this morning, I didn't realize that when setting back to factory settings that it put it back to video, higher resolution, higher CPU usage and stuff like that. And so it created all this kind of lag and I was freezing. Anyways, worked that out this morning in the morning prayers, so thank you for your patience. Also want to let you know that we've got the Patristic Faith coffee here. I put a link both in the description and then in the chat. This is a single origin. It's from Honduras, ethically sourced, roasted by our friends and collaborators, Lore Coffee. So it goes to supporting both patristic faith. Jay and I have also gone in on this, and Lore Coffees. So it's important to kind of reinvest our money into the Orthodox community, so that really helps. So purchase your coffee there, and 25 people, let's go. Put a link in the chat for academia.edu where you can find and follow along with my paper. And let's just see real quick. Tag, you are it. There you go. You thought we were going to talk about my paper and epistemology. We're actually going to talk about the movie Tag and why atheists hate it so much. No, I'm kidding. Also, feel free to send in your donations and super chats. The link's provided there, and the bio in the chat as well. So this is a paper. I can kind of give you the background on this paper. I became interested this last year why people find the Orthodox Transcendental Argument for the existence of God so difficult. What are the various problems that people have? What are their strongest objections? Even if they agree with the argument, what are the strongest kind of objections that they've heard? And my attempt was really to just kind of get into the psychology and headspace of those outside of this, particular area. I've obviously been working with transcendental arguments for quite some time, and so it's obviously it makes sense to me. But in developing arguments and polishing them and making them better, it's always helpful to kind of get outside of yourself and into the headspace and psychology of others. And so many people sent some wonderful objections and comments. I didn't address them all. Also, I was working with some other articles that many aren't familiar with from Russ Mannion, who's a friend and mentor of myself that I grew up with, learning the transcendental arguments and just watching to see how he kind of developed his own arguments, or how they've developed over time, and kind of synergized with Russ Mannion on this. And also what you'll notice too is that not only do I obviously cite Russ Mannion, is he's developing these arguments over time, but I've developed my own kind of unique arguments within TAG and some epistemological issues that come up. So let's go ahead and go over that. Again, the motivation of this was to figure out how people are having such a hard time with what obviously seems to be the clearest thing to me. It's so obvious. And so I opened the paper with a quote that where I quote myself. In fact, I'll just quote myself through the entire paper. But I joke, but sort of not. But I start the paper saying the hardest problem is convincing people the problem isn't hard at all, but simple. And that really kind of captures the Orthodox version of the transcendental argument for the existence of God. Is that once you get it, it's really simple. But that's the hardest part, is getting people to actually see what's so simple. So, without further ado, let's explore my paper. And I'm doing this too because Jay and I are going to do a review of it and discuss it. So I wanted to go over with the paper with all of you first, take any of your questions. But the title of the paper is The Reason for Reason. So what is the reason for reason? Let's inquire first into what we mean by the term reason. Because we use a lot of these terms, and again, in a good philosophical paper, you want to define that. Typically in philosophy, reason means the faculty or processes by which we make logical inferences, acquire knowledge, etc. Now, it can also mean the a priori principles that stand opposed to sensation and perception, which obviously many of the empiricists deny. For our purposes, we're covering today, I'm going to be talking about the former and not the latter. That is, the faculty or processes by which we make logical inferences, acquire knowledge, etc. within the domain of epistemology. So when I ask the question, what is our reason for reason, what I'm asking is whether our cognitive processes by which we make logical inferences. Clearly, we have cognitive processes. We agree to that. And then we make inferences, logical inferences, deductions, arguments. We say we acquire knowledge by these cognitive processes. And what I want to know is, are those processes by which we do all those things that are categorized within epistemology, are they normative? And are they legitimate? Now, I have a footnote here, again, just to kind of give some clarity through definition. And I state that we can take normativity to simply refer to the idea that something is justified. A belief or action that one ought to hold or do, or a state that one ought to be in. That's what we mean by normativity here. Now, second, what I'm asking, or what we are asking, is what reason, evidence, or argument would there be to support the fact that our cognitive logical processes are normative and indeed epistemically legitimate? I use that term legitimate as opposed to valid, since I don't want to confuse people. Validity has a technical meaning in logic and philosophy, and so we could call an argument formally valid and still wonder or ask further questions about whether validity gets us to knowledge. Assuming the argument's sound, it has true premises. So whether a valid argument, deductive argument, should be used, I mean, we don't ask these questions. Again, this falls within the terms of kind of normativity. We accept it, but I want to know the reason for that in terms of normativity and justification for the use of those terms. So I just coined the term legitimate. It seemed more appropriate, being connected to normativity within this context. Furthermore, how would we even go about, we've got to ask this question, how are we even going to go about establishing that the supposed reasons, evidence, and arguments are in fact acceptable? Sometimes this is called the criteria problem criterion. These considerations obviously fall within the domain of what's called meta-epistemology. Why? Because in epistemology, in some sense, we just take these things for granted. To roll it back and ask more fundamental questions about normativity of what falls in the domain of epistemology is meta-epistemology, and therefore we seek to discover what would truly be a non-problematic epistemic first principle. Now, when I say epistemic first principle, it doesn't commit you to foundationalism or any particular epistemic theory. What we mean by epistemic first principle is one that's truly the reason for all of these epistemic processes that would ground knowledge. You get that? There's no further principle, do you see? That by which you have to judge a truly epistemic first principle. So it's an ultimate, think about it that way, an ultimate epistemic principle that is appealed to, that's not problematic, to justify all other epistemic and normative claims, but is not itself contingent upon and or justified by other epistemic principles. That's what we mean. All right, so far so good. Let's see how you guys are doing in the chat. So we have one gentleman says, do we need to prove that we do have knowledge and reason, or is that always presupposed? That's really what it's about. So I would say you do. Obviously we presuppose it, but what we're looking for is what's going to justify me making claims that I'm in possession of knowledge. If, for example, it's possible knowledge doesn't even exist. We've seen what the skeptics had brought up. So simply presupposing knowledge and saying, well, I don't have to prove it, isn't going to do the job. So, an meta-epistemic analysis is looking, first of all, does knowledge exist? Even if we presuppose that it does, how would we go about justifying that? And what principles or worldviews or philosophical positions or lack of position would make our claims about knowledge impossible? Because if we don't have to if we don't have to actually justify the existence of knowledge, then why do we have to justify anything? I mean, one could just ask and be like, well, I just presuppose this. I don't have to justify it. So it does seem that it is required at some level. Okay, let's go. What is justification? Now, there's quite a bit of literature on the topic of epistemic justification, what precisely justification is, what qualifies as justification, etc. For the purposes of this talk, there's no need to go further into the details of this debate, or these, I should say, plural debates. Assuming a general notion of justification that could fit various philosophers' theories on epistemic justification will suffice. So think about it this way. Justification is generally thought to be a reason, or a correct reason, to hold a belief or make an inference to another belief. In other words, epistemic justification is a right-standing belief with respect to knowledge. And because we're inquiring into what makes knowledge possible and what would serve as a justification for believing knowledge and reason exist, we're asking a meta-logical and meta-epistemological question there. So that's to answer your question in the chat. Do we need a reason? And if we don't need a reason, don't you ever have to reason that you don't need a reason? Do you see what the problem is? So we need a reason. A correct reason. And that's what we're looking into. Moreover, we assume logic, as you brought up in reason, to be normative and legitimate. We do presuppose that. We assume we can know things. However, when we ask for justification for the normativity and legitimacy of these two things, we're asking what makes these fundamental presuppositions or assumptions true. And what possible answer or answers could serve to be the reason why logic is true. Why it's normatively binding. Why do I have to hold to that? Why ought I? Why is it legitimate? What is the reason knowledge is possible, and what reasons would legitimately explain how we can know knowledge exists? And we'll talk about that. That's a second order inquiry and claim. Ultimately, these questions hinge on what constitutes as the necessary preconditions for knowledge and how it is possible to have access to them. Notice that second part. So what constitutes it, and then how do I get access to the necessary conditions? Let's move to the section, the failure of autonomous epistemology. When we consider the existence of knowledge, facts, the validity of logic and arguments, conclusions derived from experience, an important question arises for the reflective inquirer. How does one determine that human reason, unaided by any other powers, so within the sphere of reason alone, how do we determine it can actually accomplish what it sets out to do? That is, to know reality, to know what is true. In other words, within the sphere of human reason alone, can we ever determine whether knowledge exists? I have a footnote here. This is important because this was brought up. I presented this paper to fellow Orthodox scholars and professors, and there was an objection that was brought up, I've seen it before, to that the justification is kind of an indubitability, that I can't deny logic without using logic, so it's kind of self-evident, self-justificatory. So I put a footnote in here. One may be tempted here to respond that because, here's the other objection that I've heard before, that as long as there's no kind of counterexample, that this serves to be a justification. The universality of logic is undeniable, and as long as there's no counterexample to that, we should accept that as the justification. But does the mere fact that we are psychologically so disposed that we cannot think of a world other than logical categories justify us in concluding that the world is bound by those categories, for example? So I'm just maybe psychologically determined that I can't do this without that. I can't think outside of that. That's a statement of, that's just kind of a descriptive statement. Notice justificatory is normative. Why should I think that automatically, that's a condition that serves as justification? Oh, just because we say so. Oh, I'm begging the question, because I can't think otherwise. But that's exactly what's in question. Why is the indubitability a justification? And how do I answer that without bootstrapping and begging the question? It just is, because I say it is. And the further question is, again, so I'm just psychologically predetermined. I'm just given a descriptive fact. I can't do this without doing this. That makes no claims about the world, that the logical categories correspond to the world anywhere, that let alone serve as justifications or conditions for knowledge. The psychological inability to modify the way we think about the universality of logic does not prove that it is in fact universal. It merely means we cannot modify the way we think about it. And that's a point that Russ Mannion brings up in the contingency of knowledge and revelatory theism. So, wrong, sorry, you don't get away with it. You almost got us, you almost fooled us, but yes, psychological inability does not equate to justification. However, since everyone presupposes something, a pre-commitment to using logic, reason, evidence, and arguments, there is no one who is presuppositionally neutral when it comes to factual questions and experience. Now that's important because the use of reason, logic, evidence, and arguments can't be something proven by experience or reason. It is that by which one proceeds to prove everything else. And when we think about that question, or that situation, what we find in such an analysis is that rather than proving facts, one is inevitably going to beg the question. And two questions arise within this consideration. One, well, what are the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, science, logic, experience, morality that must be presupposed to ground and justify the use of reason, logic, evidence, and arguments? And two, can human reason, when isolated solely within its own sphere of reason, ever determine whether its processes are legitimate such that we can know anything without falling into vicious circularity or epistemic bootstrapping? Now, I don't deal with it here, but obviously our cognitive neurological mechanisms and different stuff could not be wired correctly. We know people who suffer from mental illnesses and brain damage and things like that obviously are not holding to beliefs, even if they get sometimes a belief that's true, for the right reasons. And so, how do we determine, I mean, if we admit that, again, this person is deficient cognitively, and so they don't have justifications for what they believe, I mean, what's our reason that our cognitive mechanisms are legitimate? Oh, because we're not like them? I mean, we could just have another type of cognitive impairment. So again, we're begging the question that, well, is it the majority? Is it, I mean, how do we determine that? You can't without begging the question. Engage in a vicious circularity, because if I'm isolated solely within my sphere of reason, in my cognitive sphere, I have to appeal to the one thing in question that could be incorrect and trust it to be able to say that, well, this is how we know. So it's vicious circularity, it's epistemic bootstrapping. And because there's no one who's presuppositionalist, and since all of our presuppositions will determine how we see our fellow man, the world, knowledge, our minds, science, ethics, epistemology, we will evaluate what possible presuppositions there are that would determine how we see all these things. All worldviews, epistemologies, positions, and philosophies will boil down to either being autonomous systems or theonomous. Now, one of the objections I heard is atheists. I don't have a worldview. So, first of all, my argument isn't contingent that somebody does have a worldview. That's why I'd actually put whether you do have a worldview, and I seriously doubt somebody doesn't have a worldview. You have a position on something. Or you have a position about that you don't have a worldview. I have a worldview that I don't have a worldview. You have a presupposition. You have certain presuppositions. That's why I said there's nobody that's positionless or presuppositionless. And so I don't care if I could grant and be like, okay, you don't have a worldview. Any of those things that I just listed will fall into either one, these two categories. Either it's an autonomous system or position, or it's theonomous. I'm going to discuss what each of these positions entail and their consequences for the possibility of knowledge later. However, let's turn to the fundamental difficulties with what I call autonomous epistemology. There are several fundamental problems with what I call autonomous epistemology. And by autonomous epistemology, I mean any attempt to construct a philosophical account of the world or make a position on the assumption that it is possible that God does not exist. Now, notice the atheist is, I don't have a position. Well, your position is that you don't have a position on God. Is your position that it's possible that God doesn't exist? Now, this could even apply to theists. Right? I'm thinking of natural theologians. Begin with an epistemological and metaphysical worldviews and assertions in which they believe that there's a common epistemic and starting point with the atheist, meaning, oh, it's possible that God doesn't exist. So I don't have to ground my metaphysics or epistemology in God. It's something that I come to once I build an autonomous system and assume that this is a justification. Then I can actually prove God later, and then we find out God does exist. I would call that like a Thomistic system, a natural theology system, the Cartesian epistemology, all of those as are included even within the atheistic or agnostic group of fallen under autonomous epistemology, because they all assume it's possible that God doesn't exist, and possible for man to possess knowledge and give a coherent and justified account of knowledge independent, autonomously, from the existence and revelation of God. All of those that I mentioned share that in common. And so they're autonomous systems and autonomous positions. So either one sees human reason is grounded in God's revelation, which is the precondition and starting point for the possibility of any knowledge. That would be theonomous epistemology. Or one sees human reason is independent, autonomous. Let's see, I've got a footnote here, footnote 8. Nice footnote here from Russ Mannion. The first story is of an epistemology in which man is aided, the theonomous. It is epistemology that's grounded not by man, but by someone who is in a position to know. It's grounded by God. It is a theonomous epistemology, Russ Mannion says. The second story is of an epistemology in which man is not aided. It is an epistemology that's grounded in man and by man. It is an autonomous epistemology. That's from the contingency of knowledge and revelatory theism. So Russ Mannion gives a nice kind of definition of what we mean by these two terms. All right. There's much talk about the various epistemic theories, worldviews, and positions regarding the world. However, as I'm going to show, no matter how many different theories, religions, and philosophies there are, they really only boils down to two possible epistemic starting points or presuppositions that can be taken. Let's read this footnote here. It's a good one. Footnote 9. These two kinds of worldviews describe very different worlds. They tell different stories about how the world came to be, about the nature of the world, and about the nature of man. They give different accounts regarding man's relationship to the world and how the world can be known by man. These two accounts of man's knowledge present us with two very different epistemological stories. The first story is of an epistemology in which man is aided. It is an epistemology that's grounded not by man, but someone who's in a position to know. Right? That's the theonomous. And the other is man is unaided. It's an autonomous epistemology. Okay, moving on. Let's go to the section. Let me just see what you guys are doing in the chat real quick. Yeah, I don't have to grant that somebody has a worldview. Again, that's why I point out you're not positionless or presuppositionless, and that's all I need. I mean, clearly you have a position about a lot of things. So they think this is a sneaky trick that they can get out of. But it's just, these people just recycle these kind of Reddit tier arguments, and they think they're successful. Yeah, that's Father Arseni Boca, by the way, somebody noticed. I've got a lot of Father Arseni Boca. Here's another in my prayer book, Father Arseni Boca, here. 56, awesome. Jay Dyer, you can come in here too, and feel free to share anything. I responded to Jake's criticism. It just was clear that he didn't. He accused me of. Yes, he accused me of begging the question, circularity. Obviously, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It was really clear. But I do actually talk about that because Jake wasn't the first one to to make that claim. All right, let's move to the section. Put in your epistemological horse before your metaphysical cart. Now, in one sense, metaphysics is prior to knowledge. Why? Because it would be the ontological structures of the world that would determine whether knowledge is possible, how it's acquired, and under what conditions knowledge is obtained. I mean, we can imagine a world so constructed, whether it's our neurobiology, cognitive mechanisms, or just the world itself and our relation to it, in which knowledge isn't possible. So, in that sense, yes, metaphysics in one sense is prior to epistemology. However, the difficulty is one has to know what metaphysics is correct in order to determine what epistemological account is correct. In other words, since metaphysics will determine epistemology, how and what you can know, we will have to, here's the epistemological horse before the metaphysical cart, know what the correct metaphysics is, right? Because there's multiple metaphysical offerings and accounts. However, I can't answer this, the metaphysical part, without establishing a correct epistemology, the second part. And I can't establish a correct epistemology without the second part. And so on. Do you see the problem? Now, somebody had brought up that, oh, this is the problem of the criterion problem by, why am I blanking on his name? Chisholm. Well, no, it's not. So people think, well, Chisholm has a way out of this. Just kind of like start with the method first, and if this is not the same problem, like it's similar in that there's this kind of dialectical tension, right? And I can't answer the first without the second. I can't answer the second without the first. I mean, it's similar, but it's fundamentally different. It's inescapable. Now, I'm going to, again, show how this is the case and how autonomous man, this arises because of man's pretended autonomy, and therefore autonomous man cannot make any justified claims that knowledge exists or claim to be in possession of knowledge. Now notice that. Knowledge may exist. I can even grant that. But the claim that it is something very different. And that dilemma occurs because of the finitude of man. The fact that man does not stand in an epistemically or metaphysically privileged position to resolve this dialectical tension between the two categories. So I can't get to one without two, and two without one, and one without two, and I'm in a circle right there. I've made an important distinction elsewhere, and you'll see footnote 10, an Orthodox critique of natural theology that I presented in Volos, Greece at the IOTA conference in 2023. I made an important distinction there in that paper between first-order knowledge or first-order claims. So that would be something like, S knows that P. S knows the tree is green. And second-order claims or second-order knowledge. S asserts or claims that they know that P. Or it could also be S knows that he knows that P. Now, the distinction I make in that paper is often overlooked. I got some feedback and people missed what I was actually trying to say. In inquiring into what are the possible justifications which would serve to ground knowledge, so we're talking about grounding knowledge, and our claims that knowledge exists, we're asking for second-order questions about knowledge and the justification that's distinguished from first-order statements, regardless of whether first and second-order content is the same. So that was one person says, well, it's not a problem. I don't have to provide any separate justification in the second order. For second order, because it's about knowledge and the content's the same. But that's missing the point. Furthermore, these distinctions are not to be confused with familiar issues in epistemology concerning what's called the KK thesis. And you'll see I have a footnote 11 on that. And pointing this out, that these aren't the same issues, that we're missing the point, if we think it is, I'm avoiding the whole debates between internalism, externalism, and everything else. I can grant it's possible that a person S knows that P. And if they know P, it's possible for S to have second order knowledge, that they know that they know. So what I'm saying there is, I acknowledge first order knowledge is not contingent upon second order knowledge. So I'm not saying you have to know that you know, or that you have to justify second order claims in order for knowledge to exist, or in order to know. I'm granting that. So it isn't the issue of and epistemology of the KK thesis. But again, that misses the point. Our question is not about knowing particular propositions. Does John know that the tree is green? And does he have to know that he knows in order to have knowledge? No. I'm talking about generally the existence of knowledge. Not about particular things. So that is a second order issue. And any assertions about the existence of knowledge that we're making, so John might well be knowing the tree is green. We are not John. Do you see, we're at a meta level looking and talking about whether John knows and how we would actually justify that. So we're at a second order. So any assertions about John at the first order will inevitably be a second order statement that we're making, that will necessitate knowledge exists at the first order. Therefore, our second order statements about knowledge can only be justified. In other words, we can only say that knowledge exists, or that John is a possession of knowledge at the first order in general, if second order about knowledge can be justified. And our second order statements about knowledge can only be justified if we provide justification for the existence of knowledge in general at the first order. And we're going to see that this is a problem. It's a serious problem. It's a serious and insurmountable problem. So, this is crazy. This actually came to me in a dream. A fever dream, just like John Nelson Darby. No, I'm kidding. It came to me in a dream, though. And I get lots of weird stuff in dreams, in which you think in the dream it makes sense, and then you wake up and you're like, what was I thinking? But in this dream, I had kind of intuition that I think I'm onto something, and I end up in this dream, like a lot of dreams, I'm debating somebody. Surprise. In this dream, this was, probably like 4 or 5 months ago, I'm debating an atheist. And this argument comes to me and I was telling myself in the dream that I'm like, I think there's something here. Don't forget this. Make sure that you bring this argument out of your dream and analyze it while you're awake and sober. And so I'm going to liturgy and I'm telling the subdeacon as we're driving down, I had this amazing dream where I got this argument and I can't remember it. I actually forgot, but I do have the memory that I think it was actually a good argument. And only after the liturgy did it, and receiving the Eucharist, did it actually come to me? I'm like, I got it. I remember what the argument is. So then I remember, so I'm always doubting myself. I'm like, is it good? Maybe I'm deceiving myself. Maybe I'm an epistemological prelist or something like that. And so I called Jay up and I shared with him the argument, and to get some sort of kind of like objective feedback, so I'm not completely in my head. And he was like, I think that's a good argument. And so I ran it by a few other people too, and they all thought it was a good argument. So I put it in the paper, and it goes like this. And you can follow along here if you have the paper on page 4, down at the bottom of page 4. Premise 1, if it is true that knowledge exists, first order, then our beliefs or statements that knowledge exists is also true. Premise 2, the first order must be affirmed if we're to affirm the second order, correct? 3, however, any affirmation or statement about the first order is a second order statement. Therefore, one can never affirm a first order statement, or the first order statement, because one is always making second order statements. Therefore, autonomous man cannot establish if knowledge exists. Much of this argument, this critique that I made, hinges on vicious circularity. Here's an important note, and this will address Jake and others. And later in the paper I address more of this too, that you're just tags just begging the question. Well, I make a footnote in here, footnote 12. There's not a problem with circularity per se, since words will be employed to give an account of words in semantics. Arguments will be used to discuss other arguments, and philosophical paradigms will be self-referential. The problem occurs when we attempt to use or inevitably invoke circularity as a means to justify something when it's unable to provide a justification. In other words, circularity is not problematic. Circularity is only problematic or vicious when it cannot accomplish what it sets out to do. That is, provide a sufficient reason or justification for knowledge. So you don't get me to just be like, oh, that's circular, right? At some level, circularity is unavoidable. But when we're talking about, yes, obviously an epistemic first principle ultimately, an ultimate one, will ultimately be self-referential and circular in that sense. That's not a problem. It's, does it do the work? Does it actually pull off the job? Okay, so let's go back to this argument that I give you and basically kind of boil it down and make it more clear for you. Let 1 stand for knowledge exists. 2 stands for the statement knowledge exists. What I'm saying is 2, the statement knowledge exists, cannot be true if, or put it this way, 2 can only be true. The statement that knowledge exists can only be true if knowledge does exist. 1. So 2 can only be true if 1 is true. However, when we inquire into whether 1 is true, all attempts to confirm that 1 is true will involve 2. In other words, I can't get to 1 without 2, but 2 is dependent on 1. Therefore, I never get to 1. I'm always in the 2 sphere, and I'm trying to get to the 1 sphere. Consequently, autonomous epistemology either resorts to trivialness. What does that mean? Knowledge exists if knowledge exists. Knowledge exists because knowledge exists. It's tautological. Or it assumes what it wants to prove. Second-order statements are assumed in order to prove first-order statements, and first-order statements are assumed to prove second-order statements, which is vicious circularity, an example of epistemic bootstrapping. So that circularity doesn't pull off the job that we want it to do, and that's why it's vicious. Now, critics of my argument have claimed that I'm erroneously asserting that there is a demand for justification for second-order beliefs, and that this can be objected to on the grounds that people will have different conditions for what qualifies as justification, or different models of justification. But that misses the point entirely. The problem isn't simply that second-order beliefs require justification, but rather epistemic models of justification of the first order can never be justified on any model. I can grant whatever model you want. I don't really care. They can never be justified, because of the fact that autonomous epistemology is always going to result in either trivial tautologies or vicious circularity when attempting to provide whatever sort of justification for first-order statements about knowledge. Again, to state that there isn't a difference in content or mental acts between second-order meta-beliefs or first-order regular beliefs by pointing out that they're instead constitutive does not deal with the issue at hand. And notice, those are all epistemic claims and statements. I mean, how do I know that that's true or that's a good reason to believe what the person's telling me, that I should believe them? Oh, because what I'm saying is true. So my argument doesn't hinge on second-order beliefs being distinct, independent mental acts that require additional beliefs as their supporting relation. The point is that there's no way to provide justification on any model for knowledge from an autonomous starting point. The question will always be, how do we determine that knowledge exists and provide justification for this belief that knowledge exists? The answer from any autonomous epistemology or any epistemic autonomous starting point will always be, well, if my made-up story is true about knowledge and everything that I've been telling you that's literally just made up, I just made it up, or we all voted on it. If that's true, if it ends up to be true, this is how we would know that knowledge exists and how we justify that knowledge exists. What's your justification? Well, I don't have any justification for it other than if it were true, my made-up story is true, then it would be true. Do you see what the problem is? And 13, footnote 13, is just another, I quote Allison, an epistemologist on epistemic circularity, and I just kind of provide more of a formal logical argument. Allison says, we cannot suppose ourselves to be justified in holding the premises unless we somehow assume the conclusion, which is exactly what I just stated. So in a formal way, you can see this is laid out in footnote 13. If S's belief that P is justified, let's call that capital P, and that's a first order, then S's belief that P is justified, if its belief is justified, if P is actually justified. That whole consequent right there is a second order statement. So let's call that R. So premise 2, P is justified. Let's assume that. So this is actually a modus ponens. So let's assume premise 2, P is justified. First of all, P does have knowledge. Therefore, S's belief is justified. In other words, it's just a really kind of fancy way of saying what I laid out there. Our second order, if the first order is justified, if we can justify the first order, then the second order is justified. The first order is justified, i.e. knowledge exists. Therefore, my statement about knowledge existing, or the first order, my second order statement is justified about the first order. In other words, if P then R, P therefore R. But this R is in the conditional, the first premise is true only if P is justified. Okay? However, if we ask how or why P is justified, we get the following. If P then R and if R then P, since the formal definition of epistemic circularity is if P then R and R if R then P, autonomous epistemology is always committed to epistemic circularity and cannot provide justification for the existence of knowledge. So that's just a more formal, I know it's kind of nerdy, but Manning points out the history of epistemology demonstrates that man unaided cannot attain a foundation on which to base a theory of knowledge. We will see that any theory of knowledge that originates solely from man, this is what I'm pointing out, must be characterized as arbitrary, ambiguous, or incoherent. Do we not just see this? But if man has no coherent theory of knowledge, he states, then his beliefs are without warrant. And I'm talking about the second order beliefs here. And if his beliefs are without warrant, then he can make no claim, second order, to be in possession of knowledge, even if he is. Therefore, autonomous, by the way, that is a quote taken from the contingency of knowledge and revelatory theism. And I conclude, therefore, autonomous epistemology cannot give a reason for reason and can make no claims that knowledge exists. So far, so good. Before we move to the next section. Yes, I've read, I really did. I read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy in undergrad. I actually really liked it. I think there's a cool thing in there about time as well that I actually like to use. But again, Smoky Mountain says we have empirical proof of the greater self and the collective. But again, that is an epistemic claim that you have no proof for. And if I asked you, how do we know that, you would do exactly what I pointed out. Well, if my made-up story about the greater self and the collective subconscious and empiricism and blah, blah, blah is true, then wouldn't my story be true? So there is no justification for any of those claims. Let's see. Tag who says, earlier on in the live stream I asked about my reformulation of the criteria problem. It coincidentally resembles your argument here. It's similar, but it's different. Because I'm not simply asking for a criterion, right? The similarity is the dialectical tension. But it's what I'm bringing out is a far more profound, it's much more of a epistemological, metalogical question between first and second order. So any solutions that one offers for the Chisholm's criterion problem isn't going to apply here. Like simply because, well, I notice there's a similarity between, because it's dealing with epistemology and criterion justification, is not enough. This is more fundamentally a insurmountable problem. All right, let's move on to something else really important, meaning and narrative construction. Now, what does meaning have to do with knowledge and our concerns for justification and epistemic grounding? There's no need to go into the various philosophical theories of meaning and linguistics in this paper. For our purpose, we can simply assume a common notion of meaning within our ordinary language. Example I give is, for example, this sentence has meaning. Not to go into a bunch of theories. It's like, in ordinary language, people understand that. And that's enough for the purpose of our paper. Our language performs the function of conveying information, for example, cognitive meaning, and serves to provide an explanation of things in the world. This is why, as Russ Manning states, quote, any attempt to interpret the world, whether in part or as a whole, involves a narrative construction. This is why the atheist isn't going to get out saying, I don't have a worldview. You just made a statement about statements and the world. And it's going to imply that whether in part or as a whole, you have some type of narrative construction. Again, that's why I said nobody's presuppositionalist. And we seek to formulate coherent sets of propositions, for example, which will easily fit with the available data points that we're talking about. End quote. Proposed justification, metaphysical counts, and epistemological systems do not exist as atoms in a vacuum, atomically in a vacuum apart from a narrative. Yes, not every narrative will be seen as a proposed justification, metaphysical count, or epistemological system, but every proposed justification, metaphysical count, or epistemological claim will imply a narrative. All this relates to our current considerations because we cannot say that something is true justified or counts as knowledge while at the same time assuming that those things are meaningless, right? Therefore, truth, justification, knowledge, etc., all presuppose that they are meaningful, and that there's a meaningful world. However, not all narratives are the same. Some fit easily, some not so easily. Some self-stultify. That is, they contain propositions which preclude the possibility of narrative construction itself. We should consider then that all such self-stultifying narratives are meaningless, and therefore useless, and therefore need not be explored as possible interpretations of the world. Nevertheless, there are really only two narratives to consider, and with that, only two possible proposed justifications that could be offered. Let's move to the section Theism versus Accidentalism. There are only two stories. One is a story where there is no God. In the world, laws, arguments, logic, et al. Ultimately have to be explained, right? Explained from what? The assumption there is no God, or the lack of commitment, or the possibility that God doesn't exist. Now, the other story is where there is a God who purposefully and intentionally creates the world, the laws, arguments, logic, and man who can know and have access to these things. These are antithetical stories. One is a story of purpose and intentionality. Now, by intentionality, I don't mean the technical, philosophical, linguistic sense of directness or aboutness, but more in a colloquial sense of being synonymous with purpose. The person has an intention. God has an intention, and therefore there's a purpose behind these things. The antithesis of this is accident. Therefore, accident is the presupposition of the other narrative. Let me do footnote 17. The world's an accident, says everything there is to say about the world. Only if this statement is not true does it mean anything. And that is what we mean by self-stultifying. Any narrative which starts this way is meaningless. We cannot proclaim the world to be an accident and then go on to describe it in some kind of way of a secular sacrament, declaring itself manifest to scientists and all who have eyes to see. Nature is either revelatory or it's not. If it is just an accident, it is not a revelation at all, neither secular nor sacred. Any narrative which seeks to impute meaning to accident is itself meaningless. That's a meaningless statement, and it's a meaningless narrative. And only if the world is meaningful does it make sense for us to argue with one another. This is something that a lot of us, Jay, Jim Bob, and others, right? People actually assume meaninglessness while they make meaningful statements and make arguments from a meaningless world. Thus, the one thing we know, if we know anything, is that it's not accidental. That's Mannion's demarcation in a meaningful project. So, think about that. In that narrative, in that story, you have accidental knowledge. Accidental meaning. Accidental laws. Accidental logic, et al. All of that's an oxymoron and self-defeating. Why? Because when you look into the definitions of knowledge, meaning, laws, logic, it precludes accident. You can't say I have accidental knowledge. The accidental laws of physics, they're defined in antithesis to accident. So if your narrative and explanation of those things is accidentalism, it's an oxymoron and self-defeating. Consequently, the non-theist view cannot justify any of its assumptions about the world, knowledge, arguments, laws, and logic. In fact, it assumes the theistic view of purpose and intentionality to even talk about these things. To even say you're wrong assumes my position. You're defeated as soon as you begin to talk, right? You lose the argument. Therefore, by impossibility of the contrary, revelatory theism is true and the only thing that could possibly serve as a justification or the reason for reason. And that is God in his revelation. Footnote 18, as it is meaningless to interpret the world as accidental, then the only meaningful way to interpret the world is as intentional. There are, at bottom, only two ways to view the world. So I don't care if you have a worldview or not, you're looking at the world. You're making statements about the world. And you can only do it in two ways. Theistic or as meaningless. Ross Mannion says Christians choose theistic. There really isn't any other choice. That is from his paper, Atheism, Two Portraits. Moving on. Transcendentally deducing theism. Let's see how you guys are doing in the chat before we... My epistemic cart got into an accident with my metaphysical horse. Yep. Feel free to send in some super chats too to help support us at Patristic Faith. You can send that in here to the Streamlabs. Nobody wants to give any super chats today. I'd much obliged if you did. I'd be very grateful and thankful. Okay, moving on. Transcendentally deducing theism. Since the use of reason, logic, evidence, arguments, etc. is not something proven by experience or deduction, that's why I can't be like, well, experience proves that. It's that by which one proceeds to prove everything else. The task of discovering the necessary conditions for the possibility of knowledge lies within the domain of what's called transcendental arguments. I give a footnote 19, just the kind of general form and the term transcendental argument, and the history going back to Kant and his critique of pure reason, and you could read that. In other papers, for example, an Orthodox theory of knowledge, an epistemological of the apologetic methods of the Church Fathers, I've provided several arguments whereby it can be shown that God can be transcendentally deduced. I've illustrated this using both a modus ponens and a disjunctive argument. And footnote 21, I just inserted it there. You can see that. Many critics accuse me, and this is the response to Jake and others, of arbitrarily assuming God is the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge, and state that although the argument is valid, God simply serves as a term or placeholder for the argument. So if you look at footnote 21, you're like, that doesn't prove God. You just like, the argument's valid, but it doesn't prove God. How do you know God is X? And okay, you're just putting that in. So I presuppose rock, like it, right? I can just put anything in there. That's what they think I'm actually doing. However, they conclude that therefore any term or axiom, right? They always say this. It's axiom. My axiom, I just put in a different axiom, could serve to make the formal argument of the modus ponens that's actually illustrating the transcendental deduction. They'll be like, well, that'll make the argument work. And that'll defeat the theist's argument that God is the necessary condition. However, I'd like to point out that God is categorically different than axioms and terms. Atheist axioms are otherwise. Why? Think about it. An axiom's finite, contingent, not self-explanatory, nor self-justifying. It's not a person. Axioms are propositions. They're non-personal. Axioms don't possess knowledge. They're not knowers. They're not in epistemic privileged positions. And furthermore, I'm not using God simply as a term. As I've argued in my paper, An Orthodox Critique of Natural Theology, the term God is not a rigid designator and cannot possess a meaning independent from the special semantic and logical behavior, that's the rules and instructions, in which it's used within the particular religion. Garby points this out. Notice footnote 22, he states, there is no such identifiable individual that would qualify for the single referent of the term God. Or there are as many as there are describing a certain identity. The term God is therefore a flaccid designator, even for monotheists, which could pick up different values in different religious frameworks. So I talk about that and cite Garby in my paper on Orthodox Critique of Natural Theology. Therefore, when we use the word God in the transcendental deduction here, we're referring to the meaning of that term as it's defined and conditioned within the Eastern Orthodox Christian faith. That's why the transcendental argument for the existence of God has rightly been identified as an argument for an entire paradigm, not a term, not a generic God. Okay, so you can't use that. The second critique is related to the first that I've heard. It's objected that transiently deducing God is circular. Here's the response to Jake and others. Since we cannot know he exists by some other prior epistemic means, that is, he can only be known by assuming he exists and is the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge. In other words, we assume he exists in order to know he exists, which is circular. The problem, however, like I said, isn't with circularity per se, or whether circularity is ever allowed. Why? Because circularity can simply mean an instance of self-reference. 23, footnote 23 says to go see my other footnote 12 about self-reference and circularity. In principle, if one did truly find an epistemic first principle, an ultimate epistemic principle, it would be self-referencing and self-authenticating. It would be known by some prior epistemic principle or independent epistemic principle. It wouldn't be first then. So what's the problem? The problem is whether one's supposed epistemic first principle that they're asserting or trying to plug into that does the work that one wants it to do. If we don't recognize that these presuppositions between a term, right, that I'm actually in the transcendental deduction using the modus ponens and the disjunctive syllogism, if we don't realize that we're not simply just putting the term God in, because of the reasons I said, or an axiom, nothing will serve that, but that there's a dichotomy, right, a true disjunction that's categorically different between everything else. Then anything and everything, as the critic says, could be presupposed. But they don't realize that that's self-defeating too, because then there would be no critique of theism. So if you're critiquing that going, well, I can just put anything else I want in there, right? If you strawman my argument, you think that's what I'm actually saying. Well, then there's no critique of theism, right? Since every presupposition would be no better or worse than any other presupposition. It's just an axiom. So why can't a presupposition other than God serve to be the reason for reason? That's what we really want to know, right? An epistemic first principle that can ground knowledge that's not God. The easy answer, which obviously never seems easy, the way I started with that quote in the beginning of the paper, is that autonomous epistemology, as I've shown earlier, cannot accomplish this task. And since it's either autonomous epistemology or theonomous epistemology, revelatory theism, the only possible reason for reason that could serve to provide justification for the existence of knowledge is God in his revelation. Let's see what I put for footnote 24. Mannion states, quote, our epistemology is validated by the revelation of God and the story contained in that revelation. Notice he's not saying a term. The term God's not important. The revelation of God and the story contained, the paradigm and the story that contained in that revelation. God's revelation is self-authenticating because by it everything else is authenticated. The difficulty is getting people to see the reality of this true disjunction and to accept that all their attempts are simply ad hoc, an autonomous system building again. And that's what it's always going to be. So whatever your critique of this paper is, guess what? Like, even if my argument isn't great in here, guess what? You're still in the fundamental problem of ad hoc autonomous system building that's always doomed to epistemic failure. And people are always going to do that. If my story is true, it turns out to be true, it'll be true. And watch me make up another story and another ad hoc system and this distinction here while missing the entire point. They don't give it up. And the reason why they don't give this up, and the reason why it's so hard for them to see the simple problem, is because people like their idols and are often reluctant to give them up. Another objection that I've heard is that transcendentally deducing God does not prove the existence of the Orthodox Christian God. What about other religions? Well, that's similar to another objection, that in order to prove God exists as the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge and therefore prove his existence by transcendental deduction, you would have to demonstrate that all other worldviews are false. Have you heard this one? Stop me if you heard this one. So, atheist walks into a bar, says, you're going to have to, says to the theist, using the transcendental argument, you're going to have to prove, if that's a real disjunction, you're going to have to prove all other worldviews are false. And since it's impossible, given that there can be potentially infinite number of worldviews, one cannot prove that the Christian God exists via transcendental argument. You've heard that, right? 71, awesome. Let's see, I'm just going to see if anybody threw in a super chat. I saw y'all on everybody else's stream throwing in super chat, so you broke now? I'm joking. Okay. So you've heard that objection, right? The problem with this objection, however, is that most worldviews or positions can be reduced to a few more general options or principles. And ultimately, those reduced to either the position of intentionalism, remember not in the technical philosophical sense, but revelatory theism, or accidentalism, the negation of revelatory theism. So we're just back where we started from, or started at. Since accidentalism is a defeater for knowledge, it must be revelatory theism. However, there's only a few options here to consider. What's that? Religions that claim to be special revelations from God. Right? How many options do we have? I put, maybe you could think of a few more. Talmudic rabbinical Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Mormonism, varieties of Protestantism, Roman Catholicism. Those would be the major, ones that claim to have special revelation from God. Now, I have heard people say, as an objection to me, yeah, but it's possible one can miss a religion. What if there's an unknown religion? And if you don't get that and you don't get, cancel that out and show that that's false and is a defeater for knowledge, then you can establish the possibility of the contrary so as to show orthodoxy is true. Let's just stop and think about that. A hidden, unknown, missing religion that's claiming to be special revelation from God. It's not revelatory if it's not revelatory, if it's missing and unknown. And so we're back to autonomous epistemology, which was shown to be false. So again, there's only going to be a few options of And I don't have to worry about, did I miss one, right? If it's missing, it's obviously not revelatory theism. Now, I'm not going to go through in this paper or this talk right here, like, well, how would you show that? It can fairly be easy and shown to be defeaters for knowledge as well, especially anti-Trinitarian. And why the triad's a necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge. Then basically, I'm just describing generally how I do this. It's not the task of this paper, but as far as Trinitarian religions, if you have occasionalism, if you have determinism, if you have nominalism, right, I'm thinking about the Reform phase, these end up being defeaters for knowledge. If you reject or do not accept the energies doctrine, then again, you're in the task, you're back into an autonomous system, making all kinds of assumptions about a causal chain. The problem with an infinite cause and finite causal chain, there is no proportion, and so I can never even get to the knowledge of God as a necessary condition. Why? First, because I'm epistemic bootstrapping. Well, I can do it if my system works that I just made up in my head that I have no justification for unless it's true. And second, even if it were true, you're still referring to a phantasm in your head because there is no proportion between infinite cause and a finite chain. And I'm sorry, Aquinas' response that, well, it doesn't have to be perfect, is another ad hoc. How do you know that? It's another ad hoc rescue. Well, as long as I say it's not perfect. Again, it also assumes what it wants to prove, that there is an analogia entis without the energies through the causal chain. How do I know that? Well, if my made-up story is true about it and all my ad hoc modifications that I made, wouldn't it be true? What's the justification for that? Everything that I just made up. So we can eliminate the other Trinitarian competitors as well. So that's generally how you do it. That's it. They can be eliminated, and orthodoxy can be shown to be true. And also we could look at, it's not like we deny evidence, historical evidence, like what's historically contiguous, has historical continuity, right? That's what is not only defeaters for doesn't have the defeaters for the possibility of knowledge, but which one is coherent, that doesn't have mutually excluding propositions within the story, the revelatory story that they're giving. So how is it that one can dictate? Here's another thing I want to say. So once I get people to realize this, once we go through these arguments, watch what happens. Watch what the critique of this paper is going to be. They're going to be like, that doesn't work. Your argument doesn't work. Well, wait a minute. That's not a transcendental, that's not how logic, that's not how second order, first order, they're going to make all these epistemic claims about logic and epistemology, semantics. Well, how are you going to dictate, that's not a true disjunctive. How are you going to dictate what's required for demonstration when it was shown that you were not in a position to account for knowledge and make epistemic claims and cannot provide justification of the truth and normativity of logic, inferences, and demonstrations? And we just give this people, we allow them to do that. You have to remind them, I might be wrong, but you don't have anything to say about it. I have a note here in response to that, because I want to steel man their argument. Of course, one can simply respond that I'm doing an internal critique based on the normative epistemic standards assumed in your own paradigm of religion. while acknowledging, obviously, they're not in a position to give an account. So I've seen that. Okay, I'm not an account, but I'm just doing an internal critique based on what you're saying. However, that seems absurd, since a person is assuming they can know what I'm even saying, right? I noticed this with the two nice atheists that I was discussing, right? They were doing this. They think, well, we don't have justification in my account, so I've got out of the problem. Or I'll accept skepticism. I'll resign to skepticism or something like that. So I don't have to give an account. Do you see that they're playing the burden of proof? You're the one making the claims. I don't have to. Do you understand what I'm saying? Oh, yeah. Are you making epistemic claims about your skepticism and being in a position not to know? Or position about what my position is? Then you're making epistemic claims and require justification. You're assuming you know what demonstrations are, that you know. You know what one's paradigm of religion believes. You're making claims about it. Before you can actually justify it if knowledge exists. So it's a sleight of hands. They're trying to get out of this, right? While they're slipping in all these justificatory and epistemic claims that you call them out on. Or worse, in a world in which knowledge is impossible, they assume that, okay. A common response to this is that one can simply assume knowledge exists, I've seen this, without having to justify that it exists, because either knowledge exists or it doesn't. And perhaps later we find out, and get the justification for the existence of knowledge. But nevertheless, we're stuck and we should use it. We should use the assumption that it exists to form critiques of given positions. However, it isn't clear how this would have any normative force, right? Suppose I grant that to you. What's the normative force? I mean, basically, if you're saying it's possible knowledge doesn't exist, but I'm assuming, so it ultimately amounts to what? Accidental. We accidentally find out that knowledge exists. It might be an argument or critique. It might be an argument if it ends up being an argument. Oh, accidentally it turns out it's an argument. If it turns out to be one, then what? It's an accidental argument. I accidentally discovered an accidental argument against your position. And accidental arguments, brother, carry no justificatory normative force. Do you see? So even if I grant you that, you don't win. You didn't win the argument. You didn't sneak out of it. And that's what everybody's trying to do. You got to catch them. They're sneaky. They're sleight of hands. They're con artists. Trying to pull a con on you. Why? Because they're avoiding the inevitable. There's nothing more clear, as Pascal says, than the existence of God. If it wasn't for all these ad hocs and system buildings and stuff, right? So what's the hardest problem? Convincing people the problem's not hard at all, but simple. It's rebellion, though. Like, that's what's hard. And they're couching in that it's intellectual. It's not. And it becomes very obvious when you discuss with these people. You are trying so very hard to deny the obvious. Okay, so everything that I gave, right, these objections, I figured out something. I think what it illustrates is a phenomenon I entitled Missing the Epistemological Forest for the Epistemological Trees. Whether it's Oppie or Malpass, and all the atheists online are just mimicking their arguments. Anyways, what I notice about them, they're just regurgitating it. What I notice about most of them is they're focusing on the details of formal arguments. For example, I've seen people bring up why am I blanking on the name? Just give me a second. Strawson's critique of transcendental arguments. And then somebody will try to use that. Do transcendental arguments actually prove God? Malpass, whether true disjunctives are trivial, because it's like either you have, I think one of his arguments was either it's not a true disjunctive, but if it is a true disjunctive, it's trivial. Let's look and see what I say in footnote 27. One objection is that transcendental arguments for the existence guide is either not a true disjunctive argument, and therefore you commit the fallacy of false dichotomy, or if it is a true disjunctive, either A or not A, it's trivial. So what do they mean by trivial? What is meant here is that a true disjunctive still doesn't prove anything. So if disjunctive either A or not A would be a true trivial, not A, not A, therefore A. So since denying not A is logically equivalent to asserting A, so all true disjunctive syllogism reduced to the following: A, premise 1 A, premise 2 A, therefore A. That's what would be considered in logic trivial. However, this is only true if there's no reasons or evidence to deny not A. They miss this, and then they're sleight of hands. Which, if affirming not A leads to a contradiction, for example, a reduction ad absurdum, or makes knowledge and meaning impossible, then guess what? You have a reason beyond simply affirming A to deny not A. So that objection doesn't work either. But that's to miss the point entirely. Because what I realize is, because people want me to basically, you have to answer all these objections, right? And they're all these kind of formal, epistemological, logical things, so you have to get into the details. But really what's going on is, it's missing the epistemological forest for the epistemological trees. There's a bigger issue than what they're pointing out, so that I don't actually have to, in one sense, even answer any of these particular objections. It's ignoring the main problem outlined earlier, that autonomous epistemology cannot account for knowledge. So what do? They want to reduce everything to the one thing that was shown to be epistemically bankrupt, and then force all of my discussion, or our discussion, into the all my arguments and discussion into and be filtered through their autonomous epistemology or philosophy that's incapable of providing justification for their epistemic claims. Right? However, that's to really get caught up in the insignificant details of arguments while missing the larger epistemic issue, the meta-epistemic issue. What grounds and makes knowledge possible? What makes logical inferences, deductions, arguments, etc. normative and legitimate? In other words, even if you showed that my argument's bad, right? You're focusing on the epistemological tree. You're missing the epistemological forest, the main issue. Even if my transcendental deduction doesn't work, here's the question you've got to think. What comes first? This is the epistemic forest, the larger question. What do you think comes first? Epistemically speaking? Arguments, including transcendental deductions or transcendental arguments? Or the necessary condition for all arguments? Think about that. What epistemically comes first? The modus ponens, the transcendental argument, a deduction, a disjunction, or the necessary conditions for the possibility of any of those arguments? Therefore, whether the technicalities of my argument in this paper work, or fail at some level is simply irrelevant to the larger issue at hand, since we're asking a meta-logical question that's epistemically prior to all the details of individual arguments themselves. The larger issue is this. It's either an intentional world, a purpose with God who purposely creates and sustains that world, or it's a world of accident. Right? Now again, there's something self-referent. It's like in the sense of words. If I'm trying to justify words, I use words and temporal priority, even though that the semantics or the theory would be epistemically or linguistically prior to the words, but I'm always stuck in the words box. So it's the same thing when I'm using a transcendental deduction. God's not strictly proven by that, and I'll talk about this in a second. It's just I have to use inferences and arguments and temporal priority to refer transcendentally to what's prior to transcendental inferences and deductions. That's why I asked the question, which one comes first? Let's make this real easy. So, again, the larger issue. If you're focusing on the logic of the argument and the disjunction and the modus ponens and all this different stuff, any objection that you're going to bring up, you're going to be missing the epistemological forest for the epistemic tree, because the larger issue is this. It's either an intentional world, a purpose with God who purposely creates and sustains the world, or it's a world of accident. And if it's a world of accident, not God, then there are no meaningful statements. There's no internal critiques. There's no knowledge. There's nothing that can be said, even about my paradigm, or our paradigm. However, in order to affirm that it's actually accidentalism, not God, one must presuppose a world in which meaning and knowledge are possible, which is not possible on the accidentalist view. Therefore, one cannot affirm accidentalism, non-God, or even the possibility of it. Hence, by impossibility of the contrary, God and revelatory theism is the only option. And this also shows why God is not something that's strictly proven. Since this would mean that we'd have to first be able to justify the possibility of knowledge, discover the correct epistemology before we have the correct epistemology, remember as I showed before, by which we would prove God. Prove God. Rather, God is that by which everything else is proven. As Mannion perfectly states, therefore, strictly speaking, God is something not deduced, since this would depend on our man-made unjustified systems. Oh, sorry, no. As Mannion, that was my statement. Mannion perfectly states, there's no purely rational case for theism, but there's only a theistic account of rationality. Isn't that great? So as I stated and concluded, therefore, strictly speaking, God is not something deduced, since this would depend on our man-made unjustified systems, which would in turn assume that there's something prior and independent of God, by means of which he, God, can be proven. God's revelation is not validated by some autonomous epistemology. Rather, our epistemology is validated by the revelation of God and the story contained in that revelation. So God's revelation is self-authenticating, because by it, everything else is authenticated. This is why God is the Lord, we say in the Psalms, and he has revealed himself. He doesn't reveal himself as a generic God. He reveals himself in orthodoxy as the triune God. And his revelation demonstrates he is the reason for reason. The only reason for reason. Blessed is God, who enlightens everyone who comes into the world. That's the end of my paper, and This is why, if you think about it, as I'd stated, I raised the question, what's epistemically prior the necessary conditions for the possibility of knowledge? And arguments, including even transcendental arguments, or the argument, the transcendental argument. The necessary condition for the possibility of it. That's why God can only be the only starting point. And this is why it seems to me so blasphemous. Natural epistemology assumes that there is some type of independent, prior, epistemic principle that's higher or behind God that God has to be proven by. I mean, how blasphemous is that if you're a Christian? I mean, that's why I said, strictly speaking, God is not something to deduce. He's not. There's nothing that stands behind God. If, as shown, He truly is the ultimate first epistemic principle, the denial of which, or the inability to accept it, means there's nothing meaningful that can be said, no arguments that can be made. And so, this is what we mean in one sense, that God's truly apophatic. There's nothing can be said. There's nothing that stands behind God that God's reduced to or proven by. It's utter silence. It is God Himself who has revealed Himself. And because there's nothing that stands behind God, no arguments, no logic, no words, no semantics. Because He's the creator of all those things, He's not proven by them, even though we're in the language and logic and argument box. We simply make the distinction between temporal priority and epistemic priority. We affirm God is truly apophatic, and that God's revelation is not validated by some autonomous epistemology, some independent epistemic standard. But those all the first order and second order claims are grounded and proven by God and His revelation and the story contained within that revelation. And that's why it's self-authenticating. Is it circular? Circular in the sense that it's self-referential and self-authenticating, but not that it can't do the work. I mean, who else would be in an epistemic privileged position? An axiom can't be. A system can't. A propositions. By impossible the contrary, it must be the Trinity. The one who's metaphysically and epistemically in a position to know. One's not in a problem of being infinite, of reduced to the dialectical tension between the first order and second order, between the dialectical tension between, was finite, I mean bounded. That between epistemology and metaphysics, so that I have to put my epistemological horse between my metaphysical cart, but my metaphysical, the metaphysics determines my epistemology, but I have to actually know before I know, so I know what metaphysics. That's boundedness, that's finitude. Guess what? God transcends that. Not a finite. You start thinking about why is it that even if we said this is circular, would it work? Because that presupposition is the only thing that could possibly work, and it's radically categorically different than anything else that we could say. It's not. God is not a proposition. He's not a term. He's not finite, right? It's the negation. That's why it goes back truly to that radical disjunction. And always, everything will boil down to that actual true disjunction. So, God is, as Russ Mannion points out, not the conclusion. So God is proven, not as the conclusion of a rational or empirical theistic argument, but as the very ground of argument itself. And it's only with surrender to God's view of Himself, the world, and ourselves, that one can even articulate a coherent theory of knowledge. Otherwise, what do we have? Autonomous epistemology, accidentalism, that ends up being arbitrary, viciously circular, epistemic bootstrapping, and ad hoc, and can't accomplish what it sets out to do. So by impossibility, the contrary, God is the Lord, and He has revealed Himself, and He's revealed Himself in orthodoxy as the Trinity. All right. We covered it. That's it. Let's see. It's taking any super chats. Awesome. Hessian Beard donates $50. Thank you so much. He says, pray for us sinners. My prayers for you. Thank you all who have been joining me in the morning prayers. That's been really nice. Tag Hua, is there a criteria problem for distinguishing first and second order statements? In other words, first principles would need to discriminate from one another. But that depends on our identification of some existing particular knower. I'm trying to understand that. And Tag Hua donates $10. Thank you. Let's see. First principles would need to discriminate from one another. So if you did offer a first principle, we don't know what it would be. They'd have to discriminate from one another, but that depends on the identification of some existing particular knower. Maybe. Yeah, I'll have to think about that some more. Let's see, other questions. I'm glad that we finished this up. Get to do pre-sanctified tonight. That's fine, Christian. Yeah, anything that you guys have is much appreciated. Anything you can donate, even your prayers, are much appreciated. So, Dobus V, did you, in this, I actually show, go over that objection, all the others. I show exactly how all the others are self-stultifying, meaningless, and make knowledge impossible. And why it's truly a disjunction between Orthodox Christianity. So it's not just the Christian God, it's Orthodox Christianity. Like I said, there are not an infinite amount of positions that can be boiled down to a few principles and ultimately boiled down to either it's autonomous or theonomous. And then within the autonomous, only a few, right, because theonomous is revelatory, there's only a few religions that claim to be special revelations of God. So, consider a few of those, and we'll see exactly why it necessitates a Trinity, as I described. And then among the Trinitarians, what do you have? Protestants, Roman Catholics, and Orthodox. Pretty easy. And why in Protestantism it would be make knowledge impossible. Why it's self-stultifying, why in Roman Catholicism, which I talked about. Typically, within Protestantism, holding to other kind of philosophical views like occasionalism, nominalism, determinism. But something that both Roman Catholicism and Protestants would hold is the rejection or lack of accepting the energies doctrine, which then reduces you right back down to I couldn't actually get to the necessary conditions. Because if you saw or heard in my talk is, so let's say there's the possibility for the possibility of the necessary condition. That's not how do I get to it? How do I again get to affirm that there is a necessary condition? If it is based in a system that I constructed, right? That's an autonomous system, or a system that makes knowledge of the necessary condition impossible, then we're back where we started from. We never get to it, and that's something that I show. And I showed, I've talked about in other places too, why I could go over real quick why a Trinity. Also, Adobus, notice what the atheist is saying. They press you on proving the Christian God. They're making epistemic claims and normative claims. You ought to do this. This is what you... They're not in a position to say that. You have to do this. Oh, grant me all of my assumptions, unjustified assumptions, so I can make an argument against me. Or grant me the one thing that was actually shown that I can't use so that I can make an argument that you have to do this. Do you see the sleight of hands and the trick there? Don't do it. You're under no moral or epistemic obligation to do that. I talked with a friend last night. Pareka says, Father Hears talks about crucifying mind to open news to Christ. I find logical arguments appealing, but also bringing pride. Aren't logical arguments double-edged swords? So, one of the things that we don't want to do is create the antithesis of, well, we don't do that. We don't do intellectual arguments. We don't do philosophy. And then we're presented in like almost the way the Roman Catholic would think a mystic is. We do mystical, right? Like we just pray and stuff like that. In Orthodoxy, we believe that we are actually the one true holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and the Greek word kataholos, pertaining to, according to the whole. There's many pieces that go into a whole. And pieces that go into a whole need to be in the right place. If we take them out of the wrong place, if we elevate them higher than they are, this is where problems are. This is what heresy is. So the problem isn't about arguments and logical arguments. It's where is their place in orthodoxy? What's primary? What informs arguments? Now, again, what did I actually show? I actually showed using an argument, as Paul, when in Rome, speak as the Romans do, and as is he on Mars Hill, use the arguments to actually show that God is prior to argument. He is the argument for arguments. And I'm providing an inference to that. I can't get out of the argument game, right? Or the argument box. I can't do that. But I can point somebody to that using words and arguments, that which is beyond arguments and words. What's truly apophatic, which grounds all of that. And there, the intellect's put in its right place. Now, the priority, what informs my intellect is my nous. So, by crucifying the mind doesn't mean that I don't do philosophy or engaged rigorously in argument and debate. It means that my intellect, my intellectum in Latin, is not guiding the rest of my life. And I think you really see this kind of in the West. Because in Eastern Orthodoxy, what it means to sacrifice my intellectum, my mind, to my heart, to my nous, is not a cancellation, but a guiding and informing. Very much the way that a spiritual father, right? So we don't stop thinking. When I go to my spiritual father, I don't stop thinking, be like, whatever he says. I don't throw out my conscience. My spiritual father informs my conscience. My nous informs my intellect. So it's the order and placing of that. And that's why, I was talking with some friends. Prior to becoming Orthodox, all of my theology and philosophy depended on my own arguments. Why? Because I didn't have an anthropology I had this kind of dualistic, the body and the mind. And the mind obviously is higher than the senses and the body, and so everything had to be filtered through my own arguments. But I'm fallible, and in fact, worse than just being fallible, I make tons of mistakes intellectually. I've made arguments that don't work. I've had to recant. And I have to base my entire faith and reality on my own mind is quite scary. But in orthodoxy, I don't, because my knowledge doesn't come through my arguments or my mind. My knowledge of the Orthodox faith is being true comes in noetically. That's why there's no... People are like, do you ever doubt? I'm like, nope. I don't doubt orthodoxy. Now, I could give you a falsification principle, right? I'm not creating a non-falsificationism, right? But I know in my heart of hearts. Well, you knew before, right? I knew in my intellect, because that's all I had to go on. But now I've become aware of the news, the heart of hearts, and I've entered into a personal relationship with Christ, the Trinity, and the saints. I know them more than I, even know my wife, right? I don't have to prove my wife through arguments to know her, but I lived a life with her, and that's the strongest kind of knowledge. I know what the saints and the Trinity does. I see how the holy things work. And so what that means is, like I said, missing the epistemological force for the epistemological truth. Even if my argument, something in this paper is shown to be wrong, I'm not wrong. Just means, oh, your argument wasn't that great. But the argument for argument can never be wrong. The epistemological force, that's the issue. So, again, all I can do is just polish up and be like, sure, okay, maybe I made a technical mistake or something. Like, the argument still, works. It still wins. There's no way around it. Even if you get me on a technicality, it's a win. God wins. Orthodoxy wins always, right? And I know that, noetically. And so my nous informs my arguments and how I refine these. Does that make sense? What else? We have 49. We had up to... So we have 52 up to 72 at one point. Pretty good. Is there somebody else streaming right now? You guys just, I wore you out. There's not really... So look, let me make a distinction. There is a technical discipline of metalogic and metaepistemology. And there's books about that. But that's not really what you're looking for. It's going to be a kind of a formal system and pretty advanced logic and epistemology. You'd need, to be able to read that and kind of understand that, you'd need a couple introduction to informal, then formal, and possibly even some modal logic, all of which you're going to have to know predicate and propositional logic, formal logic. So there's somewhat of an equivocation. When we talk about metalogic or metaepistemological, right, I'm talking what's even prior to those disciplines. So in a general sense, and not the technical sense of the logical or epistemological disciplines known as the metalogic or epistemological. I saw this came up with one guy who was calling it. It's like, that's not how it works in metaepistemology or metalogic, and was citing rules. And it was hinging on the equivocation. What Jay was talking about, again, is the larger issue that's even prior to what the person's quoting out of the the rules that are known in metalogic. So yeah, there's plenty of books in terms of metalogic and meta-epistemology is a discipline, but not what we were talking about, because it's even prior to that. All right. Other questions? Let's see if we have any other super chats. And then I can make some announcements. Go ahead and leave a comment for the algorithm. Share this video. This is going to set up for Jay's and our analysis of this and some of the arguments and critiques that he's been given. And again, what I did in this paper is very different from... There are two arguments that I've developed in a fever dream. No, it turned out to be two. Accidental argument in a dream. That I hadn't presented before. And took into, again, account, the whole spirit of the paper, too, is to take into account what the psychology, like how people were viewing the transcendental arguments as they, for the Orthodox God that have been presented thus far. So, I hope that you enjoyed it. No, I don't think we're going to do it today because in about 50 minutes I need to take off. And my wife and I are going to go to the pre-sanctified liturgy at our parish. I want to announce that... I'll just pop this up real quick. I have so many windows open. If you want more of this and would like to support myself in patristic faith, you can go to either on patristic faith itself or patristicfaith.myshopify.com, and you'll see that I actually have full courses, a third of a course, these various things of pre-recorded lectures available for you, epistemology, and so full courses range anywhere from like 21 to 24 lectures, about an hour and a half each, and they're university college courses. They're, again, these are pre-recorded. Epistemology, we have ethics, third full course, introduction to philosophy, third and fourth, logic and critical thinking, philosophy of science, political philosophy. Also, we have tutoring available here. And this is below the rate. Like, I know a lot of our friends and people that I know that do tutoring anywhere from 100 to 120, so bring this down to 90. And then even if you want to do a package of 3 at a discounted rate, that's great. This is really great. We're just concluding our logic and critical thinking Canvas course. And that's a full-blown interactive college course that we're actually going to work to try to even get accredited, because it's the same educational software that I use at other colleges, that I've used at other colleges to teach logic and critical thinking. And the reason why that's much more is you're getting much more. These are all just kind of pre-recorded. You watch them at your own time. There's no interactive. In this, you have... It's an asynchronistic course, and the reason why we chose that is it's virtually impossible to get everybody committed to the same date and time to do live lectures on Zoom. So it's pre-recorded embedded logic lectures here. But in this educational software, and you can see, I could actually go through courses. I'm just going to show it to you. You have fully access to this. So you have like weekly announcements, check it, like I'm checking in. But you actually have assignments on each section of each chapter. You have exams. There's 3 exams that are graded. Again, I gotta switch that date, but I'm gonna release this because we're in our last week of this. I'm gonna let them take the final exam, and you have the option of basically it's a 16-week course. You can go week by week, and you're given, as far as check-ins, if you want to do that option, there's like weekly check-in assignments as well as these kinds of assignments. But people also can choose the option of go at their own pace. If they go at their own pace, they don't need to do weekly assignments. And they can do all of this at their own time. But like I said, for the ones that were wrapping up the 16-week course, the not go at your own speed, there's one more assignment and a final exam and a paper on a debate review. There's discussions, the syllabus, there's files, there's modules, and so you have even given the answer keys to all the problem sets, free textbooks here. I've got a 7th, 11th, and 13th. We're using the more, so you get a free $120 book. And then also what you get with this is every week live office hours. You see here, Zoom link to office hours. Now that we actually have to vote on and choose a date and time. Typically we were doing Thursday night, 8 p.m. Pacific Standard. And that itself makes the whole course worthwhile because you're promised at least an hour. It's the office hour. We usually go 2 hours. And you get 16. Think about this. Think about how awesome this is. Let's just 16 2-hour tutoring sessions. So even if you didn't get this Canvas, and suppose people aren't charging $120 for tutoring, but let's suppose $100. That itself, just our live office hours and tutoring, is worth $3,200 on the market. And so you're getting all that. You're getting all of that for $850 plus all of this, and at the end, a certificate of completion with the grade, so that if and when we get this accredited that I'm working on, that's a hard process, but it fulfills all the requirements. It's the exact same course I teach, taught at the universities and colleges, so there's no impediment in that. It's just the time and process it takes to get something through all the loopholes. But that certificate will then be documentary evidence of completion that would serve retrospectively too. So since we're just finishing up the 16-week, I'll restart that. I'm also going to include probably do an ethics. People are voting on, well, what's the next Canvas course that we should do, and ethics is awesome. It's really fun. That's probably the most popular so far, so we'll actually start 2 of those. We'll restart for those who want to do the week by week 16-week option rather than going at your own pace. We'll restart the logic, and then also very shortly the ethics. And also those who can't make the live office hours, those Zoom office hours and tutoring sessions are recorded and made available for everybody, regardless of whether they're on the 16-week program or the go at your own pace. So you can find that in the Shopify. Don't forget, we partnered with Lore Coffee for Patristic Faith, Jay and I, and so the link's in the bio. Oh, it smells so good. So you can squeeze, like, there's a little, it smells really good. And it goes to a great cause of supporting our brothers over there. And Idaho, oh wow, this one is ground, I can feel, and these are the whole beans, which you can get either one, ethically sourced, no chemicals, used. This is a single origin from Honduras and helps support both Lore Coffee and Patristic Faith with Jay and I on this collab. So thank you for that. And if you didn't want to pay the price, let's say you don't have the money for the full Canvas course or any of the cheaper pre-recorded either third or full course programs, and you just wanted to try out a couple of the lectures, they're usually like anywhere from $20-$25, and then if you wanted to bundle more, I'd give you a discount. But Shopify at this point doesn't have the ability to have me list all the individual ones for you to purchase, so feel free to just write me and we could set something up like that. Also, don't forget if you haven't purchased your tickets for Orthodox Montanica, you can go to, and that's also in the description, but you can go to Patristic Faith there under events. And we're going to be releasing, I already released one of the videos, my video recording of the lecture from last year, and we're going to be releasing all of the speakers from last year. We kind of stagger that for you to get you excited about, in 89 days, our Pan-Orthodox conference with the theme of theology of the icon. And here's a kind of description of that. Slideshow here that you can check out about the monastery. There will be another monastery tour, and the hierarchical liturgy. His Grace Bishop Maxim, who's blessed this and taken this officially under his Amphoron, and with his guidance, he's very excited, especially about the topic of theology, the icon, and the speakers, which he has blessed and is thrilled about. Metropolitan Jonah, of course, the archpriest of all Montana, the senior priest, archpriest Father Andrew Moore, and then Father Matthew Garrett from St. Seraphim's Orthodox Church in Boise, Idaho. And he's an iconographer and an artist, and so is Father Turtle Qualls, our beloved Father Turtle Qualls that was here last year, who is also an artist and iconographer. I'll give a talk on image and likeness and Losky. My dear friend and colleague, Dr. Nathan Basil Jacobs, who you might also know not only as a professional philosopher, philosophy professor, but an established record of publication, amazing, but also the famous Orthodox film director, known for becoming truly human and just signing this wonderful $100 million Amazon original series deal called The House of David, and with the Wonder Project. And then our own beloved Shane Swenson, artist and iconographer, who is currently our resident iconographer repairing the temple, who will be providing a live demonstration and lecture in the temple. Here is the schedule there, and early bird tickets are still on sale until you got April 21st. 7 total meals, a Montanica swag bag, recorded sessions. You get a discounted code, 2/3 marked off the price of what the price of the hotel is. I've established with you with our partner, Best Western. Professional, 7 meals total, all access to events. Also, if you haven't, go ahead and subscribe so you can get our newsletters and announcements there. And I think, if we also have a directory, if you are Orthodox and have a business, even if the business is not Orthodox, for our community, Orthodox community, go and send in. Or if you're looking for, again, accommodation, food service, like you see it's broken down, we need that really developed, because we really want to reinvest in our Orthodox communities. If we're going to, get a service or something, isn't it better that we help our brothers and sisters. I think that's it for the announcements. Let's see if we got any more super chats before I let you guys go. Jehovah's Thickness donated $3. Heresy is a question. Fire is the answer. Good one. And how long have we been going, by the way? Usually it shows how long I've been going. All right, dear brothers and sisters, God bless you. Let's see, Tyler. I just want to read Tyler Brands. The first comment you addressed was whether or not we presuppose knowledge. The strength I've always seen with tag is its dismantling of other worldviews. Yes, incoherence, contradiction. Tag renders those autonomous worldviews unable to presuppose knowledge. However, that isn't proof. Hopefully, this draws a distinction that makes a further argument. Yeah, so the argument, I mean, there's several different kind of inferences and arguments that are being made in this entire presentation, of which maybe you could call tag or something like that. And it's an argument for an entire worldview. It's an argument for the impossibility of the contrary. And again, we presuppose knowledge, but how do I make the claim that knowledge exists? There's issues about how do I ground that? Because we could all know stuff, and yet my presuppositions about the world or whatever I'm doing in philosophical projects just won't work to establish a justification for that. So part of the argument is showing that, and then showing that the only argument for arguments it could possibly be is the Trinity. So that itself is actually the proof, while with the caveat saying, strictly speaking, there is no proof for God, because what comes first, the necessary condition for proofs, including transcendental arguments, or the argument, epistemically speaking? And of course everybody's going to say, well, the necessary condition. So it is the proof for proofs. It's the only thing that could be. So I hope that answers your question. So many tabs because I have ADD. I have AD, not ADHD, which for some reason ADD has been collapsed into, but I've never been hyperactive, but just had ADD. So I've got like a million thoughts going on, a million arguments at the same time, of which some of them are the 50 million tabs that are open there. The other thing too is with ADD is difficulties with recall and memory. And so I keep them up there because it reminds me. I'm so distracted I can't remember, like, well, what was I... There was an article that I was looking at. There was something I was reading. I was famous for multitasking, too. I am not the sort of person that reads through a full book and moves on. I'm the sort of person... Look at this. I've actually got 2 books inside of a book. Here's Ed Fazer's book. Here I'm reading through some arguments I wanted to see that he was doing about nominalism, because then it's connected to something else. And here that I was thinking about, got my prayer books and my Bible, because I got to do that too. I'm also thinking about essences and David Otterberg's real essentialism. And it's all connecting somehow, right? While I'm having my coffee and... Father Zachariah's book here for my spiritual edification through my Lenten journey. And then it all comes together in a paper. It's like, oh, I got a paper. In a dream. That's totally how my mind works. I'm all over the place. But there's method in the chaos and all the tabs. That's just me. So... Yes, the paper, I'll just put the link one last time in here. And then I gotta get ready. Ready to go to church. Jim Bob's still going? That Jim Bob, oh boy, he was I saw last night he was arguing with that atheist for like 4 hours, the same guy. And then earlier today he had a stream, if he's still going, Mixed Bag Panel, he's doing another type of stream. Well, God bless him. Go check out Jim Bob. And what will I do after ethics? Sounds like a book. After ethics. Maybe philosophy of science or epistemology. I'll make a poll. I'll let you guys vote. I'll make you vote. I'll make you vote on it. All right. So hopefully, Tyler Brown, that answered your question. It's only proof for proof that could possibly be, and strictly speaking, the necessary conditions for proof must be epistemically prior to proof. So that is a type of proof. Okay. Another atheist today? All right, God bless you guys. Keep me in your prayers. May you have a blessed rest of the week. For those of you on the West, in the Western Christianity, blessed Good Friday, and Western Easter to you this Sunday. For those of you in the Eastern Orthodox Church, May 5th. Easter is on Cinco de Mayo. What are the odds? What's next? 3 red heifers? And the third temple being built? Kidding. Or am I? God bless you guys. Thanks again for your support, all your super chats, and blessings.